The cobblestones of Benefit Street still carry whispers of a name Providence tried to erase: Deacon Ezra Rutherford. A man so devoted to God that his faith twisted into something monstrous. He convinced himself that the basement of his colonial home was heaven itself. Between 1762 and 1765, neighbors reported chilling sounds rising from beneath the Rutherford House. Children's voices echoing from underground, speaking in tongues no child should know. The cries would begin at sunset and carry on until dawn. Strange. Hymns laced with undertones so unsettling that passers-by would cross themselves and hurry away. When authorities finally broke down the basement door in March of 1765, they uncovered horrors so disturbing the colonial government sealed the records for over a century. What they found wasn't just the bodies of twin children, pale as parchment, their eyes adjusted to darkness, never having seen sunlight. It was proof that sometimes the deadliest monsters are the ones who believe they're saving souls. The basement held crude altars, symbols that matched no known religion, and journals filled with warped theology that justified the slow murder of innocents. 3 generations of families tried to live in the Rutherford House after that, but none lasted more than a month. Every family told the same story: children's voices singing under the floors, the faint smell of oil lamps burning where no lamps existed, and the unsettling touch of small hands brushing against their ankles as they crossed certain rooms. Before we continue with the dark legacy of Deacon Rutherford and the basement that became a tomb of innocence, make sure you're subscribed to our channel and hit the notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this story reshapes what you believe about devotion. And let us know in the comments what state you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery lovers. The Rutherford House loomed over Providence Harbor, a monument to Puritan prosperity. But beneath its foundations lay secrets, strong enough to shatter the faith of even the most devout. Providence in 1762 was a city torn between two worlds. On one side, the stern Puritan values that had built the colony still held sway, seen in its plain meeting houses and rigid codes of conduct. On the other, the city's busy port brought in merchants, sailors, and new ideas that chipped away at the moral order Roger Williams had established a century earlier. Ships arrived weekly from the Caribbean, carrying not just molasses and rum, but also tales of cultures living by entirely different rules. With 8,000 souls, the city thrived on what everyone knew but few spoke of openly: the triangle trade that linked Providence to Africa and the Caribbean through chains of human bondage. Wealth poured in, but it raised an uncomfortable question: could prosperity and purity truly coexist? For many, the answer was to ignore where their comfort came from. The waterfront bustled with activity that would have horrified the colony's founders. Yet the same men profiting from this trade filled the pews every Sunday, seeking forgiveness for sins they had no intention of leaving behind. Deacon Ezra Rutherford embodied this contradiction. By day, he was one of the city's most respected religious leaders. His sermons at the First Baptist Church could move even hardened merchants to tears. Standing over 6 feet tall, a giant in an age where most men stood shorter, his very presence commanded attention. His piercing gray eyes seemed to strip away the facades people wore, and his voice carried the weight of a man who had wrestled with angels and emerged marked forever. Rutherford owned 3 merchant ships: the Mercy, the Providence, and the Salvation. Their names reflected his attempt to sanctify a commerce he knew contradicted his faith. His mansion on Benefit Street displayed wealth carefully chosen to look modest. Imported furniture for function, silver from London used for practicality, and entire rooms filled with theological texts in English, Latin, and Greek. Unlike other grand houses, his had no paintings or ornaments, nothing that could invite vanity, but prosperity weighed on him like a curse. Each new success felt like another step away from the purity he craved. He saw young men from respected families drowning in taverns, their laughter mixing with crude songs rising from the docks. Women wore dresses he considered immodest, flaunting wealth instead of humility. Even the church seemed infected. Carriages cost more than a family's yearly income, and conversations after sermons revolved around business deals rather than salvation. Ezra became convinced he was the only one who truly saw Providence's fall from grace. His wife, Mercy, was 20 years younger. Gentle, with auburn hair tucked beneath a white cap handed down from her grandmother, she married him at just 18. She had hoped his godliness would protect her from the poverty of her childhood, where her father lost their farm to debt and her mother died of consumption. For 5 years, their marriage was rich in comfort, but barren of children. A silent grief that fueled gossip among townsfolk and gnawed at the couple in private. Ezra saw it as God punishing him for worldly sins, while Mercy quietly blamed herself for reasons she couldn't name. Doctors tried herbs and bloodletting, but nothing worked. Childlessness pushed Ezra deeper into theological study and sleepless wanderings through the city's darker corners. He claimed he studied sin to fight it, but in truth, he was fascinated by what he denied himself. Taverns and brothels in his eyes embodied freedom. By watching others indulge, he could taste it without breaking his iron self-control. When Mercy finally conceived in the spring of 1762, Ezra saw it as proof God had tested his faith and found him worthy. But as the pregnancy grew, so did the shadows in Ezra's heart. His sermons turned grim, warning of corruption that poisoned children from the moment of birth. He preached of innocence destroyed before it could even speak. At first, only those closest to him noticed the change. He spent hours in the basement, claiming it gave him the solitude to commune with God. But what he sought in that darkness was something far more disturbing. The basement was naturally silent, its thick stone walls muffling the life of the city above. Ezra claimed the darkness sharpened his focus on spiritual matters, free from worldly distractions. He began withdrawing from society altogether, dismissing social gatherings as unworthy of a man chasing spiritual perfection. Even when pressed to attend church functions or business meetings, he showed up reluctantly, his replies clipped and impatient. Mercy noticed something that disturbed her more deeply than his isolation. His eyes lingered on children in the streets with an intensity that unsettled her, like he was studying a puzzle that demanded a solution. On October 17, 1762, Providence awoke under a sky the color of ash. A cold Atlantic wind cut through wool and bone alike, promising an early winter. The harbor lay hushed beneath the heavy gray clouds, as though the city itself were holding its breath. That morning, before dawn, Mercy's labor began. The contractions came like tolling church bells, steady and unyielding, each one crashing over her like waves against the harbor wall. By the time Goodwife Prescott, the seasoned midwife, arrived with her worn leather satchel of herbs and instruments, the house seemed charged with a strange energy, half sacred, half foreboding. Ezra had dismissed the servants, insisting childbirth was too holy to be witnessed by hired hands. That left only the midwife, Mercy, and Ezra himself. Upstairs, he paced endlessly, his footsteps matching the rhythm of Mercy's labor, echoing through the wooden frame like the heartbeat of the house itself. He had been awake for nearly 2 days, surviving on nothing but water and scripture passages that spoke of birth, blessing, and divine purpose. The labor was grueling. Mercy fought each contraction with desperate strength, while the midwife, after decades of experience, noted things she would never forget. The fire in the hearth gave no warmth. The air was unnaturally cold, and shadows shifted in ways that didn't match the flickering flames. At precisely 7:09 a.m., the first cry filled the air. Ezra collapsed to his knees, his voice rising in thunderous thanksgiving prayers that shook the house. But when the midwife called out that a second child was coming, something in Ezra's expression changed. His gray eyes, already fevered from exhaustion, took on a disturbing edge that made the midwife instinctively step back. Twins. rare enough to draw whispers of either blessing or curse, depending on one's beliefs. In a town where every anomaly was seen as divine commentary, twins born to Providence's most prominent churchmen would be fodder for endless speculation. Samuel Rutherford came first, healthy, loud, and strong. Dark-haired like his father, his newborn cry was full and defiant. 12 minutes later came Judith, smaller but just as vital, with auburn hair like her mother and delicate features that promised beauty to come. Her cry was softer, but it ceased the moment she was placed beside her brother. Goodwife Prescott, hardened by decades of births, was stunned by the twins' bond. Most newborns showed no awareness of one another, but Samuel and Judith seemed drawn together instantly. When one cried, the other turned toward the sound. When placed side by side, their bodies curled instinctively into the same positions they had shared in the womb. The midwife declared them the finest twins she had delivered in 30 years. But Ezra's joy was laced with dread. Holding his children near the window, he looked down at the streets below. Young men stumbling home from taverns, their crude laughter echoing in the grey dawn. To him, the scene was a vision of corruption mocking everything sacred. And in that moment, certainty struck him like a revelation. The world was no place for souls as pure as these. His children represented his final test. Unlike other parents, who would watch innocence inevitably decay, Ezra believed he had been chosen to preserve purity forever. The first sign of his intent came 3 days later. Providence society waited for the formal announcement of the twins' birth, an event that should have opened the home to visitors offering congratulations. But Ezra refused. He told select church members that Mercy's labor had been difficult, and the children were too fragile for guests. It was a convenient lie, buying him the time to begin what he now called his plan for preservation. The idea took root as he watched Samuel and Judith sleep. Their unmarked faces, free from worldly stain, convinced him that God had entrusted him with a sacred mission to shield them from corruption at any cost. The basement of the Rutherford House became central to his vision. It stretched beneath the entire first floor, divided into chambers that had once served as storage, study, and prayer space. Ezra had long used the largest chamber as his private study, with its simple wooden cross and shelves of theological texts. But now he saw something different, a sanctuary where innocence could be preserved untouched by the world above. Its thick walls would muffle sound. Its locked doors could control access. Its solitude would create the perfect setting for spiritual growth, or so Ezra told himself. While Mercy recovered upstairs, exhausted from childbirth, Ezra secretly began transforming the basement. Every detail was handled with the precision that had once built his shipping empire. He installed oil lamps in carved alcoves, their flames steady and soft, providing light without the harshness of the sun he now equated with corruption. To Ezra, this was no longer a basement. It was becoming a holy refuge, a sanctuary, a place where purity would never be touched by the world's decay. Each lamp was fitted with a polished metal reflector, directing light downward and eliminating harsh shadows. Ezra believed this created a more holy atmosphere, soft, steady light for pure souls. He then turned to furnishing his underground sanctuary. The finest Persian rugs, worth more than many Providence families earned in a year, were brought down from the upstairs rooms, arranged to create separate areas for sleeping, eating, and prayer. Small pine beds were built, their frames carved with verses Ezra chose for their relevance to childhood innocence and spiritual purity. The sleeping area was placed along the warmest wall, directly above the kitchen fireplace, ensuring a steady temperature through brutal New England winters. Ezra even designed an elaborate system of concealed vents, allowing fresh air to flow without the need for windows that might tempt his children to gaze upon the corrupt world outside. For meals, he crafted a dining space, a table just the right size for a small family, with sturdy chairs that could serve the children as they grew. Pewter plates and cups, simple but elegant, stood ready at all times. Ezra believed beauty without excess was godly, and he set the table permanently, as though every meal were a ritual. At the room's center stood an altar, where daily prayers and scripture readings would replace the worldly education available in Providence's schools. Along one wall, he built shelves for a carefully curated library, multiple translations of the Bible, the writings of early church fathers, hymns, poems, and rigid theological commentaries. There were no secular works, no philosophy, no history that might challenge the spiritual bubble he was creating. When Mercy asked why he spent so much time underground, working late into the night, emerging only for meals and essential matters, Ezra explained that he was preparing a nursery, a special place where the twins would be safe from drafts, city noise, and the illnesses that claimed so many infants in colonial New England. His reasoning was convincing because it wasn't entirely false. Infant mortality was a constant fear, and the basement was warmer and quieter than the upper floors. What he didn't reveal was his true purpose, protecting the twins not from physical harm, but from spiritual corruption. By November, as darkness fell earlier and winter's chill seeped into every household, Ezra's plan entered its second phase. He began persuading Mercy that the babies needed quiet above all else. Too many visitors, he warned, might disturb their fragile constitutions or expose them to disease. His arguments carried weight. Dr. Hamilton himself had urged caution with newborns, and families across Providence had lost infants after crowded visits. But Ezra added a darker layer. Visitors, he claimed, brought not just physical sickness but spiritual contagion. Sin could cling to them like unseen dust, carried into their home and breathed in by innocent souls. Mercy, exhausted from childbirth and still trusting her husband's judgment in matters of faith, agreed. Seclusion felt like protection, and for now, it spared her from the exhausting social obligations of motherhood among Providence's elite. When Ezra finally revealed the completed nursery, it was breathtaking. Warm, comfortable, filled with every luxury their children could need. Steady lamplight illuminated the stone chamber. Shelves of scripture promised hours of spiritual nourishment. The altar stood as the room's anchor, radiating the illusion of sacred purpose. What Mercy did not realize was how thoroughly Ezra had engineered the room's isolation. The basement had only one entrance, a heavy oak door secured from the outside with iron bars and a lock only he possessed. The windows were small, set high into the stone walls, admitting air but offering no clear view of the world. Most importantly, the thick walls swallowed sound. Even loud cries would rise no higher than a faint murmur, easily mistaken for wind through timber. What seemed like the perfect nursery was, in truth, a prison. The first month passed without incident, creating an illusion of peace. Mercy spent her days in the underground chamber, nursing Samuel and Judith and marveling at their strength. The twins thrived, gaining weight quickly, their eyes full of unusual alertness. Ezra joined them morning and evening, leading prayers in a booming voice that filled the chamber. His words were beautiful, laced with love and thanksgiving, transforming the room into something that felt genuinely holy. He even began teaching hymns to the infants before they could focus their eyes, convinced that sacred music would mold their spirits from the very first breath. The routine became almost normal. Mercy welcomed the seclusion, finding relief in a life free from judgmental whispers and shallow comparisons of other mothers. She nursed, read scripture aloud, and tended the nursery while Ezra balanced business affairs above. For a time, the basement life felt strangely complete. But as the days shortened and the cold deepened, Ezra's theology grew sharper, harsher. He declared that Mercy was spending too much time upstairs, risking contact with worldly corruption. Even if she returned immediately, he warned, she might carry traces of sin back to their pure children. The solution, he explained during evening prayer, was simple. Mercy must remain in the basement as much as possible, serving as a shield between their children and the outside world. The servants, he pointed out, kept worldly influences constantly moving through the upper floors. But down here, in the depths, purity could be preserved. And in Ezra's mind, that purity was worth everything. At first, Mercy made excuses to go upstairs. preparing special meals as the twins began eating solid food, tending to household duties servants couldn't handle, writing letters to her family outside Providence. But each time she left, Ezra grew restless, pacing the stone floors and muttering prayers until she returned. His relief when she came back was so intense that Mercy began to feel guilty for leaving at all. Meals, once elaborate displays of their wealth, grew increasingly simple. Ezra argued that their diet should reflect spiritual purity. Bread, milk, and water were sufficient. Elaborate foods encouraged gluttony and distracted from prayer. The time saved, he insisted, should be devoted to scripture and devotion. The isolation began to weigh on Mercy in ways she didn't recognize at first. Slowly, it eroded her sense of self. Cut off from family, friends, and even casual neighbors, she became entirely dependent on Ezra for news of the outside world. And the news he brought was always grim. He spoke of Providence collapsing into moral decay, children corrupted before they could walk, families once respectable now ruined by vice, even the church consumed by worldly distractions. Each story reinforced his belief that Samuel and Judith must be kept apart, protected from a world that could ruin them in a matter of hours. But while Ezra preached purity underground, his activities above ground grew darker. By the winter of 1763, Providence had begun to notice changes in Deacon Rutherford. Once known for his compassion, he now studied people with a strange detachment, as though cataloging their sins for some private purpose. His sermons turned urgent, filled with graphic warnings of corruption, infecting children and terrifying declarations that parents who failed to act with severity were complicit in their children's damnation. His words were not just sermons, they were the beginnings of doctrine. He painted children as fragile vessels that could only be filled with righteousness or sin, with no room for anything in between. Then came the experiments. Ezra began haunting the waterfront taverns, not as a preacher but as an observer. Night after night he sat in shadows, studying drunken sailors and gamblers with a precision that felt almost scientific. He told himself it was research to understand sin so he could prevent it. But in truth, these nights gave him something else. The vicarious thrill of freedom his faith denied him. Watching depravity, he could taste it without partaking. But soon, observation was not enough. Ezra began engineering situations, tests of moral corruption. He gave money to desperate widows, but only after watching them steal food for their children. He left coins at their doors, encouraging them to keep stealing, to prove his theory that sin, once introduced, spread like rot. He loaned money to young men drowning in gambling debts, then followed them as they wasted it in taverns and brothels, each fall confirming his belief that once corruption entered a soul, it devoured everything. The most disturbing were his interactions with children. Under the guise of religious instruction, he visited families, offering to guide their sons and daughters in the faith. But his lessons were carefully designed to plant seeds of doubt, questioning their parents' wisdom, undermining their trust, suggesting the world outside offered truths adults would never tell them. He targeted the most vulnerable, children of struggling families, those left unsupervised, the curious and the restless. He gained their trust with small gifts, then quietly tested how far innocence could be bent before it broke. He returned weeks later to see the results. Children talking back to their parents, questioning doctrine or drifting into petty disobedience. Each result thrilled him, not with compassion, but with proof that his theories were correct. As spring arrived in 1763, Providence bustled with ships and trade. But in the Rutherford basement, seasons ceased to exist. Samuel and Judith, now 6 months old, were developing in ways both extraordinary and terrifying. They had begun to communicate with one another using sounds and gestures no one could explain, signals that seemed to bypass normal infant development. Their first vocalizations were not babbling, but warped echoes of hymns and scripture recitations that filled their days. Worse was their reaction to light. When Ezra occasionally lit extra lamps, the twins recoiled. Instead of reaching toward brightness as most infants do, they cried and covered their faces. Their eyes had begun to adapt to the dim basement glow, rejecting the very light their father now equated with corruption. To Ezra, this was proof of success. His sanctuary was working. He had created children untainted by the outside world, but to anyone else it was a sign of something horrifying. Their physical growth was normal. Their minds, however, were being shaped into something no child should ever become. Having never known anyone outside their parents, the twins showed no curiosity about other people, no desire to explore beyond their stone chamber, and no distress at the isolation that would have broken ordinary children. They seemed perfectly content in their underground world, playing with simple wooden toys Ezra had carved, listening for hours to his theological lectures, and falling asleep to the rhythm of Scripture. To Ezra, this contentment was proof that his methods worked, proof that innocence could be preserved indefinitely through strict isolation and relentless spiritual guidance. But above ground, Ezra's secret life was unraveling. His nocturnal experiments had grown reckless, his documentation of sin evolving into active participation. No longer content to observe, he began funding gambling dens along the waterfront, not for profit, but to study how quickly vice could consume men when temptation was limitless. His money bought rounds of rum for young sailors. He would follow them through the streets afterward, watching their descent into chaos, feeling both revulsion and an unholy thrill. This double life began poisoning his family. The more time he spent immersed in corruption, the more convinced he became that sin was not just possible, but inevitable for anyone exposed to the outside world. Samuel and Judith had to remain sealed off forever, and Mercy, his wife, began to look less like a partner and more like a potential weakness. Isolation was slowly breaking her. Though well-fed, she lost weight. Her skin grew pale from lack of sunlight. Worse, she slipped into delusion. She began whispering to herself when Ezra was away, imaginary conversations with friends who no longer wrote, elaborate descriptions of social events that existed only in memory. She filled the silence with ghosts of the life she'd lost. The twins sensed her unraveling in strange ways. At certain hours each day they cried together in eerie unison. Their wails echoed through the stone chamber, not like normal infant distress, but like harmonized chants, ritualistic, unnerving, more like liturgy than crying. Mercy interpreted it as singing, convinced her children were displaying the spiritual purity Ezra had promised. But to anyone else, it would have sounded like something far darker. Then came the first crack in Ezra's carefully constructed sanctuary. One night, after returning from observing a young merchant's ruin at the gambling tables, Ezra descended into the basement to find Mercy and the twins swaying in the dim lamplight. They were chanting what she called the Darkness Song, a wordless melody she claimed had come to her in a divine vision. The sound was unlike music. It had no rhythm, no structure. The fragments of words that surfaced were scrambled pieces of scripture, stitched together into phrases that carried no meaning. To any rational man, it would have been a sign of madness, but Ezra felt only joy. To him, this was proof his sanctuary was working beyond expectation. His family was transcending human limitations, ascending to a higher spiritual plane. Where others would see a woman breaking under isolation, Ezra saw divine confirmation. Yet joy was shadowed by paranoia. In town, neighbors whispered when he passed. Church members asked uncomfortable questions about why his wife and children never appeared in public. Business associates mentioned the twins less and less, their inquiries laced with suspicion. Ezra even imagined the children of Providence watching him with knowing eyes, their games including strange references to sounds rising from beneath the ground. His perfect sanctuary was no longer invisible. And Ezra knew if Providence discovered his work, they would destroy it. That fear drove him to consider darker measures. The basement, once a sanctuary, would soon become something far more sinister. The breaking point came on a humid July evening in 1763. The twins were 9 months old, crawling now, filling the chamber with restless energy. Samuel had grown into a robust infant, skin pale and almost translucent, his dark hair falling into eyes so adjusted to dimness they appeared nearly black in lamplight. Judith was smaller, but equally sharp, her auburn hair braided each morning by Mercy as part of their daily ritual. The basement that had once seemed vast was shrinking. The children's world was too small for their growing bodies and their strange, evolving minds. And Ezra knew it. By 9 months, the twins moved with unsettling precision, crawling through their underground world like creatures perfectly adapted to darkness. What disturbed Mercy most was their secret language. They sat for hours facing each other, weaving complex sounds and gestures that clearly carried meaning. When one needed something, the other responded before any adult could guess the desire. Their lives were synchronized, sleeping, feeding, even emotions, as if they shared one consciousness split between 2 bodies. It was on such an evening that Goodwife Prescott, the midwife who had delivered Samuel and Judith, appeared at the Rutherford home. She carried a basket of herbs, but her real purpose was far heavier. For 10 months, whispers had followed her. The twins had never been seen. Strange voices sang beneath the Rutherford house, and servants spoke of forbidden rooms. Prescott's conscience could no longer allow silence. She had delivered most of Providence's children and considered their welfare her lifelong duty. Ezra greeted her with his usual politeness, but the old woman was not swayed by smiles. She demanded to see Mercy and the children at once, citing her professional responsibility after such a long absence of contact. Ezra deflected, claiming it was late. The family was resting. Prescott did not relent. If turned away, she would return tomorrow with Dr. Hamilton and church deacons. Exactly the kind of scrutiny Ezra had fought so hard to avoid. Cornered, Ezra made a fateful choice. Instead of showing her the basement, he invited her into the parlor. He would test her, he later wrote, to judge her spiritual worthiness. For over an hour, the interrogation unfolded. He masked it as theological discussion, pressing her about sin, corruption, and her commitment to preserving innocence in a poisoned world. But beneath the words lay the full scope of his madness.